In our first session today on the processes that make for an effective program plan or program design, we'll start with ourselves, because intuitively we already know what it's like to have someone from outside our culture or outside our values come in and try and impact how we live. And effectively in program planning, in most cases, we are outsiders moving into established communities. So our own experience of being an insider and outsiders coming to impact our community teaches us a lot about program planning. Now, I'll share from my own story, but I want you to reflect on your own life experience as well about what you already know about program planning because of this experience. For me, I come from a rural community in Australia, a farming community, but it's not just a farming community, it's really a pioneer family community where those families were the first people to put in irrigation in the area, to dig by shovel irrigation channels, to build schools for education for their children, to collect money together to start a hospital, to develop sporting ovals for entertainment. So the pioneer families of which I grew up in really built the community from the ground up. By the time I came into the world, I'm about fourth generation of a pioneer family. And therefore the values of that community were mine without thinking. And some of those values were one was a very strong independence, independent thought, and a natural suspicion of outsiders. The reasons were partly because, one, they needed to be independent, they needed to be creative in their solutions and define solutions, and so often the solutions took some time to develop. So if someone from outside came in with a quick idea or a proposal, it would be met with some resistance and would take some time to be thought over before it would ever be adopted. So they were suspicious of salesmen, for example, of easy solutions. They're also slow to accept people. So if someone was called married into the district, that's what it was called. So it could be someone came as a school teacher and married a local girl, for example. They would say, oh, he's married into the district. But he wouldn't actually be fully accepted. He'd be welcomed, he would be treated with respect, but deep down, he would not be treated as a local, possibly until the next generation, and not until his own children had grown up and invested back into the community in some capacity, and then he would be accepted as local. So it took a generation to be accepted, and they were very suspicious of outside people with quick solutions. And the other value they had was that their word counted. That is, they could make an agreement based on their word and a handshake, and that could be kept. The reason for that, I think, is partly because everyone knew each other anyway. And if your word if you did not keep your word, you would be mistrusted. So your word was really important. So, for example, my father sold our farm when he came to the age of retirement to the next door neighbour. The reason he sold the farm to him was that something like 25, 30 years before, he gave his word to his neighbour that if he got to sell, he would offer the farm to him first. Well, his neighbour passed away and his son took over the farm. And even though my father was the only one who knew that he'd made that word, given that word, when it came to selling, he went to the son and said, I'm committed to giving you first offer on the farm. And they came up with a reasonable price. They agreed to it. They shook on hands and the deal was done. Even though someone offered more money, etc., but it was more important to keep his word. And he was happy with that arrangement. So that's an example of how the community operated. So what are the implications for this, for program planning? What are the implications for anybody who comes in from outside that community and decides that they've got a project or wants to join with the community in developing a project? Well, I can think of a few. And one is that you have to be very patient. You have to adopt an attitude of patience and waiting. As I see it, our local community lent acceptance slowly. You couldn't really earn it. If someone went by the idea that they'll work hard to get trusted, to be trusted, if they're an outsider, if they worked hard to be trusted, the community would be suspicious because they were working so hard at it. So outsiders had to become part of the community and then wait until they were lent acceptance. And that would come. It would come purely by the fact that they were part of the school, developing the school, or part of the local sports club. And over time, someone would lend them acceptance. And lending acceptance looked something like this. When a local introduced that person to another local, he might say, "He's not a bad bloke." And that term, "he's not a bad bloke," meant you can trust him to a fair degree. And so the local who's just met this person, based on another local's comment of "you're not a bad bloke," would accept him and would work with him. So that's a case of being lent, if you like, trust. So that's a be patient and wait till you're lent trust, rather than trying to earn it. The other thing that I get from this is that as an outsider in a project coming in the culture that I belong to, that pioneer culture, you should always assume that they know more about the project and the process that will work in that culture than you do. Because I know that my family always assumed that they knew better than outsiders. If you're an outsider and you think you've got something wonderful to offer that pioneer community, be very careful about how you express that, right? And always assume that they know what is best, rather than you do. Based on the same sort of thinking, I think the primary question you want to start with is, what does the community think is the next best step in developing something? That is dependent upon the fact that you've got a shared goal and vision for something. If that's in place, how you get there, you don't want to assume as an outsider you know how to get there. You want to ask the question, what do you see as the best next step? It's an open question, right? And I've taken those 3 points on in my own view of how to do project management. It will impact. You'll find that actually my views as from my pioneer family background actually impacts how I approach project planning. So in my role with Wycliffe Australia, as Director of Wycliffe Australia previously, the primary question I would ask my fellow directors in Asia and Pacific is, how do you see your organisation development? What's your next best step? And what, if anything, could we do to support you in your goal? That's like the opening question, the foundational question to program planning. But it's very much impacted by my background. So you too will have learnt from your own experience of being an insider, belonging to Insider, a group that has seen someone from outside come to impact it from your own life experience. Now, for you, I want you now, as part of this reflection process, to reflect on what are the values that you've learnt from your own upbringing of living in a community that has its own culture, has its own way of thinking, and how you reacted and responded to outsiders bringing change, and how could they have interacted with you in a way that brought a positive outcome. And what will you take with yourself when you, as an outsider, interact with another community cross-culturally to implement an important project, how will you react? What will you establish as your way of working that gives you and that community the best opportunity for success?